Hello and welcome to the lecture of International Business Environment. In this, we're going to have a discussion on the Unit 4 of Block 1, Instruments of Trade Policies. That means in this unit we will going to have discussions about the instruments of trade policy. The topics we were going to discuss today is a partial equilibrium theory of trade, non-tariff barriers of trade, quota versus tariff, exchange control, balance of payment adjustment, flexible exchange rate and fixed exchange rate. So in this unit, we will basically going to discuss about all the instruments. That means what are those instruments which we can use in the trade policies. As in the theories of international trade, we will studied about all the concepts of international theories, and yes, we actually learned one thing, that is that free trade is always better than a no trade. Free trade always gives an opportunity to a nation to grow, whereas no trade always restrict a nation to grow. And yes, it is what makes the economy as in a closed economy. So, but there are certain practices in a trade which lead to have a certain kind of barriers. जितनी भी थ्योरीज आज से पहले इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड के लिए पढ़ी गई, उन सब थ्योरीज में एक चीज तय थी कि फ्री ट्रेड हमेशा बेटर होता है नो ट्रेड से, बट एक और ट्रेड प्रैक्टिस होती है, वो ये दैट देयर इज अ रिस्ट्रिक्शंस इन द ट्रेड आल्सो. यस, economy have a full right to put out the restrictions on your international trades. Trade policies is followed by the countries that tends to restrict the trade by charging an import tariffs. Yes, there are many methods to restrict your trade. आपके trade को restrict करने के लिए बहुत सारे methods होते हैं जो use किए जाते हैं, जिनमें से tariff is one of them. Tariff is basically जब हम किसी भी तरीके की price based restrictions put करते हैं एक commodity पे. That means suppose for importing that particular product we restrict on the price basis कि you have to pay an extra money. So in that case वो जो trade है वो कहीं ना कहीं रुक जाएगा. So that is one of the reason of a tariff. But tariff is not the only mean of restricting it. There are other means of restricting your trade practices, which are called as non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers are all those governmental practices which are regulated to restrict the trade. That means ये सब वो extra practices होती हैं जो government करते हैं. जैसे for example quota. Quota is one of a practice जिसमें हम लोग एक quantity wise उस ट्रेड प्रैक्टिस को रोक देते हैं कि इतनी क्वांटिटी से ज्यादा इंपोर्ट या एक्सपोर्ट एक पर्टिकुलर कंट्री में नहीं होगा. सो दैट कम्स इनटू इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स ऑफ इन ट्रेड पॉलिसीज. तो ट्रेड पॉलिसी में हमारे पास दो इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स हैं, दैट इज वन ऑफ द टैरिफ एंड अदर इज नॉन tariff barriers. Equilibrium, that is what the PD is the main point where the demand and supplies are intersect with each other, and it gives us the price value, that this much of a quantity we can use in the international trade and this much of a price we must charge for that trade. So that comes into the partial equilibrium theory of a trade. Now we will going to having a discussions on the non-tariff barriers to the trade. What are those barriers? जैसा कि हमने पहले डिस्कस किया कि नॉन टैरिफ बैरियर्स वो होते हैं जो कि गवर्नमेंट इम्पोज करती है, या जितनी भी गवर्नमेंटल पॉलिसीज और एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव प्रैक्टिसेस की वजह से जो भी इम्पोज या जो भी रिस्ट्रिक्शन एक ट्रेड पे लगती हैं, दैट ऑल कम्स इनटू नॉन टैरिफ बैरियर्स टू द ट्रेड. देयर आर मेनी काइंड ऑफ नॉन टैरिफ बैरियर्स ऑफ अ ट्रेड, जिसमें से द वेरी फर्स्ट वन इज द कस्टम क्लासिफिकेशन एंड वैल्यूएशन. That first point basically discussed about the duty imposed on the goods. When we were talking about duties imposed on the goods, this duty is depend upon, or duty is always opposed according to the classification and valuation of that particular goods. Custom classification और valuation का ultimate यही बताने का मतलब है कि जब भी किसी तरीके की ड्यूटी या गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज पे लगती है, तो इन दैट उस गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज को हमेशा पहले क्लासिफाई या उसकी वैल्यू डिफाइन करके उस पर ड्यूटी चार्ज होता है. तो ये ड्यूटी चार्ज टैरिफ बैरियर होता है. Now, the subsidies. Subsidies are basically discussing about, or we can say that subsidy basically include, for example, the tax assumptions or preferable exchange rates. These are all the kind of barriers which are imposed by the government on the exporter just to have a proper amount or the proper practices of a business. So that's comes into subsidy. The third one is the local content and foreign investment performances requirement. This is what the basically barriers put by the government on the importer, which actually leads to increase the self-production of that particular product. That is why this kind of a barrier was basically used to give the increase or give the preference or increase the import substitution, and yes, support the internal producers of that particular good. So that comes into this barrier. Then the fourth barrier is technical standard and health regulation. This barrier was basically used for on the health and technical products. There are certain barriers which are kept in our mind for the health purposes, for the safety purposes, for the technical measurement. All these barriers are counted in this. Then the next non-tariff barrier of a trade is the government procurement. Government procurement is discussing about the barriers which are regulated by the government. Then the last one is the restrictions on the services. Restriction on the services is this barrier is basically kept in our mind when the government is looking forward to minimize the use of services. So that comes into the restrictions on the services part. So these are what the non-tariff barriers to the trade. Now, as you will going have an idea that what is tariff barriers and what are non-tariff barriers. In the very previous discussion, we will discuss that quota is one of a non-tariff barrier part. That is the kind, because tariff is related to the charging a price, whereas the quota is what charging on the quantity basis. So quota is very much different from the tariff barrier. If we discuss about quota, it is quantitative measure of restriction imposed by the government to regulate the international trade. That means when we put certain kind of quantity restrictions on the trade, that comes into quota, and tariff is basically imposed by the government on the goods. That is, it's a tax. It's a kind of a tax imposed by the government. Now, how tariff is basically preferable than quota. If we talk about the tariff is preferable than quota, the very first reason is tariff generate a revenue for the government. As in the previous slide, we shows that the tariff is a kind of a tax. That means this is what the earning for the government. So yes, tariff actually help a government to generate a revenue for the economy. Tariff इसलिए ही better कहा जाता है क्योंकि इससे एक income generation होती है nation की, and it help the nation to grow for other concepts. Then second is import quotas can lead to the administrative corruptions. Now if I am saying that because of quota the administrative corruptions may lead, that is what there may be a chances of having a corruption when there was an import quota. Suppose XYZ country restrict the import on the certain quantity wise. So in that, yes, there is the powers which are flows to the officials which actually may lead to the corruptions. Then import quotas are more likely to cause us smugglings. Yes, there is a chance in the smuggling of that particular products. Now, what are the balance of payment adjustments? When we talk about balance of payment adjustments, as in the previous session we had discussion that there was the n number of options to have an adjustment in the balance of payment. That means if the part of a balance of payment have a deficit or surpluses, they may lead to have a mechanisms to resort it. So on balancing that equilibrium, yes, there are very adjustment mechanisms. That adjustment mechanisms are, first is automatic economic processes. That means there are economy processes, the effect of exchange rates and yes, at your economy practice are BOP is very much related. That is, there is always a change in the balance of payment when the exchange rates change. So exchange rate is always differed by the economical practices. अगर आपकी इकोनॉमी में किसी तरीके की डाउनफॉल्स या अपग्रेडिंग्स आती हैं, यानी कि कोई ग्रोथ होती है, तो उस केस में यस वो आपके BOPs को इफेक्ट करेगा. So in that case, the very first is the automatic economic processes. Second is discriminatory government policies. That means अगर किसी तरीके की government policies ही impose कर दी जाती हैं, just to, जैसे अब तक हम लोग पढ़ते आ रहे टैक्सेस पर टैक्स लगा दिए, कोटा लगा चार्ज कर दिया. So इस तरीके की जो प्रैक्टिसेस हैं वो आपके इंपोर्ट और एक्सपोर्ट को रोकेंगे. तो डेफिनेटली उससे आपकी बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट जो है वो इफेक्ट होती है. So that's comes into balance of payment adjustment. That is why automatic adjustment under the fixed exchange rate, they have na key variables. किस तरह से automatic adjustments हो सकती हैं? First is the price, another is interest rate, then income and then money. Now, what is exchange control? As name suggests, it is what controlling your exchange. That means somewhere companies tries to control their exchange rate and exchange practices. And yes, many developing countries use an exchange control to restrict the trade in the nation. So that comes into the exchange control. If we considered India, and India before liberalization is having a license in exchange control process. That means companies are restricted to have a holder of a license, then only they are able to purchase the foreign currencies from the bank. So therefore, exchange control is basically an issue of a foreign currency and a part of an import licensing system. So this is what at that time this makes rupee and a non-convertible currency, because the licensing, जब हम licensing की बात करते हैं तो licensing एक method था इंडिया के पूरे ट्रेड को restrict करने का. So in that restriction, yes, क्योंकि सिर्फ लाइसेंसर्स ही जाकर उस करेंसी को कन्वर्ट करवा सकते थे, एंड लाइसेंस लेना इज अगेन अ वेरी लॉन्गिंग प्रोसेस इन दैट केस. तो इस केस में जो रुपी था वो नॉन कन्वर्टेबल करेंसी के अंदर काउंट होता है. बट नाउअडेज रुपी इज कंसीडर्ड एज अ कन्वर्टेबल करेंसी. ये किसी भी करेंसी में अब कन्वर्ट किया जाता है, बिकॉज ऑफ यस वी एंटर्ड इनटू द ग्लोबलाइजेशन एंड concept. Now, in the exchange control we get an idea कि trade को restrict करने के लिए yes companies जो हैं अपनी exchange practices देती हैं. Now, what is flexible exchange rate? Flexible exchange rate nowadays used by many countries. Yes, it is what when your exchange rate is flexible, there is a changes in your exchange rate according to the economy change in particular period. So flexible exchange rate is also called as floating exchange rate. It is basically a type of exchange rate which basically defines the currency value, and this thing allow the currency value, ये आपकी currency value को allow करता है to fluctuate अकॉर्डिंग टू दी फॉरेन एक्सचेंज मार्केट. जैसे ही बाकी मार्केट चेंज होंगी या इकोनॉमी में चेंज आएगा तो आपकी एक्सचेंज रेट्स में भी चेंज आएगा. इन दैट केस यस, दैट फ्लक्चुएशन कॉल्ड द करेंसी एज एन अ फ्लोटिंग करेंसी. दैट इज करेंसी दैट यूज अ फ्लोटिंग एक्सचेंज रेट इज नोन एज फ्लोटिंग करेंसी. तो जो करेंसी फ्लोटिंग एक्सचेंज रेट को यूज करती है वो फ्लोटिंग करेंसी भी कही जा सकती है. Now, what is fixed exchange rate? Fixed exchange rate is again a very opposite to flexible exchange rate. जैसा कि flexible exchange rate कहता है कि fluctuation in your exchange rate and fluctuation in the currency that was leads to the flexible exchange rate. Fixed exchange rate basically state that जब आपके currency के exchange rate जो होते हैं वो fixed हो जाते हैं. That means it's have a used to be stabilize the value of a currency against the currency is to be fixed to. ये basically तब यूज किया जाता है जब हमें करेंसी की एक वैल्यू को फिक्स करना होता है तब. Under this, the system of deposit in the balance of payment is adjusted by the supply changes. Due to this, yes, fixed exchange rate में there are many measurements to manage the deficiencies of your balance of payment. And fixed rate basically provide the very ग्रेट सर्टेनिटी, एक सर्टेनिटी आ जाती है आपके एक्सपोर्टर और इम्पोर्टर्स की डीलिंग के अंदर. दे कैन इजिली डील विद देयर बिजनेसेस क्योंकि उनके पास एक फिक्स रेट अवेलेबल होता है. सो दिस ऑल्सो हेल्प अ गवर्नमेंट टू मेंटेन अ लो इन्फ्लेशन. एक इन्फ्लेशन को मेंटेन करने में भी फिक्स एक्सचेंज रेट बहुत हेल्प करता है, बिकॉज इन दैट केस यस economy is not affected by that foreign markets, so that will help the economy to perform better. So yes, this is what the idea about the fixed exchange rate, and in this we will get an idea about all the trade policies, instruments of trade policies in the international trade. So this is all about for the today's session. We are winding up here. Thank you so much. IGNU MOOCs.